but you should be able to hear me now. All right. I suppose we might as well just get started here. People can catch up and watch it live after the fact. Watch the recording anyway. Although now I'm hearing myself double. I gotta turn that volume off. There we go. Looks like we got a few people at least, which is good. It's gonna take a little bit for me. I started kind of working through this study guide. So hopefully you guys can open up your own study guide and follow along. And then as I'll kind of fill it in as we go here, and we'll go from there. All right, so let's kind of talk about it, right? So just to go over the study guide, don't forget that if you bring it in filled in to the test, you will be able to use it on the test. So that's a major benefit for you to be able to do that. So let's kind of run through it, right? So following the Civil War, we know that westward movement of settlers intensified in the area between the Mississippi River and the Pacific Ocean, right? And we know that the years immediately before and after the Civil War are going to be this era of the American cowboy, and you're going to have these long cattle drives for hundreds of miles over unfenced open land in the West. They're going to get the cattle to market, right, up on the cow towns. And that's going to be the life of the cowboy in these dangerous conditions and everything that we talked about, right? So, continuing on with the study guide, right? Many Americans had to rebuild their lives after the Civil War, and they responded to the incentive of free public land. We talked about the Homestead Act, where they were provided this land for a cheap filing fee, and they were given the land to work, right? So they could live on it as long as they farmed it and lived out there for peanuts, essentially. It was pretty cheap. So anyway, the Southerners, including African Americans in particular, they moved west to seek new opportunities after the Civil War. Remember that many of these people had, the Southerners, the African Americans anyway, they were freed slaves. They didn't really have much. And as a result, they were taking advantage of the opportunity of cheap or free land. So anyway, we had new technologies such as the railroads and the mechanical reaper, opening up the new lands in the West for settlement, and made farming more profitable by increasing the efficiency and linking resources and markets and all of that good stuff, right? By the turn of this century, the Great Plains and Rocky Mountain regions of the American West were no longer a mostly unsettled frontier, but were fast becoming regions of farms, ranching, and towns, right? So we also talked about the forcible removal of the American Indians from their lands continued throughout the remainder of the 19th century as settlers continued to move west following the Civil War, right? So I didn't necessarily fill this part in yet, so I'm going to kind of do that as we go here, right? So we said prior to 1871, most of the immigrants were coming from northern and western Europe. So hopefully you're filling this in as we go. It's going to take me a little bit of a second here to kind of do this, right? So we know northern and western Europe is Germany, Great Britain, Ireland, Norway, and Sweden. And during the second half century here, kind of 1871 to 1921, the next 50 years, most immigrants are not coming from northern and western Europe anymore, but they are coming from southern and eastern Europe. So let me just make that nice and red here. Right, which is Italy, Greece, Poland, Russia, present-day Hungary, and the former Yugoslavia, as well as we know Asia, right? We're getting China and Japan in the mix as well, right? So we also know that, like earlier immigrants, these immigrants came to America seeking freedom and better lives for their families, and they made valuable contributions to, to the industrial growth is the answer here. Growth of the United States during this period, right? So remember, these immigrants are coming in. They are adding a labor force to the Industrial Revolution and effectively really helping things out as far as the growth of the country goes, okay? So moving online here, we know that Chinese workers... Whoops, it skipped down here. Sorry if this is going to be a little slow with me filling it in here, but you'll just have to bear along and you'll get the answers to the study guide here. Right, helped to rebuild the Transcontinental Railroad, and immigrants worked in the textile and steel mills in the Northeast, and the clothing industry in the Northeast, and the clothing industry in New York City, right? which again, all stuff we talked about. Let me just bold these here real fast, make them nice and red. Okay. Yeah, so we also know that Slavs, Italians, and Poles, people from Poland, right? Poles worked in the mines, the coal mines of the East, right? So let me make these all red. They often worked for not much, right? They very low pay, and they endured these dangerous conditions to help build the nation's industrial strength, is what I wrote there, right? So, oh, that's not what I wanted. That's the wrong text color. There we go. All right. So during this period, we also know that immigrants came over from Europe. They entered America through Ellis Island in New York Harbor. And the first view of America was often the Statue of Liberty, right? So as their ships arrived, following the voyage across the Atlantic Ocean. So hopefully you guys are following along and filling in this guide as we go. So immigrants began the process of assimilation into what was termed the American melting pot, we said, right? While often settling in ethnic neighborhoods in the growing cities. Ethnic neighborhoods. And they and their children worked hard to essentially adopt American customs. To really learn English. Adopt American customs. And become American citizens. Right? So these are all things that are important to being American, to being able to know the language and kind of knowing what it means to be an American from a cultural perspective. And that's how they became American citizens, right? So all important things. So we also know that despite the valuable contributions of immigrants that they made, that effectively what's going to happen is they are going to face hardship and hostility, right? Hardship and hostility. So again, all these answers I'm coming right from the website, the class website that is posted in the Google Classroom. So if for some reason you need to follow along or you don't get it off of here, you can easily fill it in yourself from the class website, right? So we know that there's going to be fear. Whoops, why did that not go? Fear and resentment. That the immigrants ultimately would take their jobs for less pay than the Americans. If the Americans aren't going to be willing to do the job for this much, but the immigrants are, then ultimately the immigrants are going to be paid, or they're going to be chosen, right? Because they're going to be cheaper to work, right? Prejudice is also often based on religious and cultural differences. Cultural differences. So we also know that mounting resentment led Congress to limit immigration through the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, right? And the Immigration Restriction Act of 1921. These laws are effectively cutting off most immigration to America for the next several decades, really. And ultimately, the descendants of other immigrants are going to continue to make pretty serious contributions, right? So let's go to growth of the cities here. So moving down the line here, as the nation's industrial growth continued, cities such as Chicago, right? Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, and Pittsburgh, and New York. Whoops, that's not what I wanted. Grew rapidly. Sorry, bear with me here for a second. All right, New York grew rapidly. Ultimately, they're going to become manufacturing and transportation centers, right? So that's a pretty big deal. It's huge. Grew rapidly as manufacturing and transportation centers. So we know that factories are going to be providing jobs in the large cities, but workers and families often lived in pretty harsh conditions. And they were crowded into, we know, tenements and what are often referred to as the slums, right? Slums of the cities, the tough, terrible housing projects today, which people associate with. And, sorry, let me just do this. So we know that the rapid growth of the cities is going to cause housing shortages and the need for new public services, right? So public services, in particular, things like subways and sewage systems and water systems and all of those things are going to become really important to the growth of cities. Sewage systems, water systems, and public transportation. So New York City was the first city to begin construction of a subway system around the turn of the 20th century, and many cities built trolley or streetcars, which are actually streetcars, lines. Believe it or not, they are going to kind of fall off in a lot of cities as the car becomes a thing. The car lobby is going to kind of push for the destruction of those transportations. So people buy cars. But anyway, so let's kind of go up here, I think. Where was I? Yep. Okay, so just going to the top here, right? So we are going to have the corporation, which means limited liability corporation, LLCs today. So the idea of a corporation is going to become a thing around this time period, right? So we also know we have the Bessemer steel process is going to be our list of inventions and things that you should familiarize yourself with. We know that Thomas Edison is going to write, right? And which with electricity as the major source of light here with Thomas Edison and General Electric is going to be a pretty important thing. And J.P. Morgan is going to be another financer of that. We know Alexander Graham Bell is going to invent the telephone, right? Which is, again, super important to be able to communicate verbally. So, right, I mean, this is kind of almost an extension of a telephone right here, right? I'm communicating with you guys through voice. So keeping down the line here, we have the Wright brothers are going to invent the airplane. So I would make sure you familiarize yourself with all of these inventions. There's going to be matching on this test, a lot of matching on this test. And we know Henry Ford is going to be the assembly line, right? And he's going to be producing the car, and he's not the inventor of cars. He just makes it much more efficiently and faster than other people, I suppose, right? So let's go. I'm going to pull this up here. So the industrial leaders, right? We know that Andrew Carnegie is going to be the steel industry. We know that J.P. Morgan is going to be the finance industry. We know that John D. Rockefeller is the oil industry. And we know that Vanderbilt is going to be Cornelius Vanderbilt, Cornelius Vanderbilt are going to be our industrial leaders and our industrial tycoons here, if you will. Some people might refer to them as robber barons for their harsh business practices that are kind of making a lot of money in this time period on the backs of other people's, right? So we know that as far as what is going to allow this all to occur, right? What are the things that are going to really push and drive the industrialization, the reasons for this economic transformation, are a couple of different things. We have this whole idea of laissez-faire capitalism. Laissez-faire, oh, that just made things way bigger. I can decrease the size of that in a second here. You have the increasing labor supply from the immigration. And then you also have America's possession of wealth and natural resources among the navigable rivers being one of these big wealth things of America, right? So all of that is pretty important for sure. So I'd familiarize yourself with that. So we also know that things are going to be tough in these areas, right? We know that progressives are going to be coming in to kind of combat a lot of the difficulties of the time period, right? So we know that they looked to combat, social, the language here is a little different than what I've had. Corruption in politics, come back. In politics, and ultimately social injustices, and began to see implementation of new policies in local governments. So let me make these red here. Right, and began to see implementation of new policies in these local governments, right? So we know that the commissioner style, this is, again, a little bit different than what I had up on the screen here as far as what I had written out, so I'm just kind of trying to follow along to make sure the language is right for you guys. So we know that the commissioner style is a group of elected people managing the city. And we also know that the city manager style were implemented to meet the needs of increasing urbanization in the cities. So in state governments, we also saw new processes which lead to ways for the citizens to directly influence, this is important, influence the laws passed by the states through the processes below, right? So the direct influence of people versus having your representatives do it is a big change, right? So we know that the referendum is here, I'll just copy it in here, is a general vote by the electorate on a single question that has been referred to them for direct decision, okay? So this is people voting on ideas of the people, right? So this is a pretty big deal, and if the referendum is passed, then it effectively becomes a law, and that's pretty important, right? So we also have now the initiative, which is a process that enables citizens to bypass the state legislatures altogether. And in doing so, they can pose their own initiative, this own concept, right, directly on the ballot with enough support. So people can vote on it without the legislators and the politicians making that a decision, right? So then we also have a recall, and a recall is pretty important too because it is a procedure, just for the definition's sake. Whoops, why did that underline? Is a procedure by which voters can kind of effectively remove an elected official from office through voting before the term is ended if they were unhappy with the way they're being governed, right? And that's a pretty big, again, change from the politics that had been existing here, and allowing the individual much more direct influence over the laws that are being passed by the states and locally, right? Which the local politics is kind of what directly affects us the most in many cases, right? So additionally, in elections, we saw the implementation of changes to the election system. So the idea of the secret ballot is extremely important. Right? People not being able to know who you voted for is pretty important. So you can vote how you actually feel you want to vote, right? That's pretty important. So we also have primary elections. So primary elections are a method that we know that the people now are going to directly get to choose, right, they're directly going to get to choose who is running for office in a particular thing, right? So previously, the party would get to decide who was going to vote for, say, president or run for president on behalf of the party. But now with primary elections, the American public has some sort of say of who the candidate is going to be. So that's pretty, again, important, being able to directly influence the outcome, right? Who you would like to see as your president is pretty big deal. So we also are going to have so we have the 17th Amendment to the Constitution is going to allow the direct election by the people of senators, right? So this direct election, so instead of what had been the past where you effectively had Congress voted for the senators, now people are going to be able to directly do it themselves, and that's, again, another way people are going to be able to influence the politics themselves over people in high places that had been there, right? So let's get to the bottom here. So we know that laws that limited freedoms, we have, sorry, why is this? Again, this is different than what I had written up. So you have the Jim Crow laws in the South. Right, so the Jim Crow laws, I'll write that again. Jim Crow laws forcing separation of the races in public places. So intimidation and crimes were directed at African Americans. We do know this. So things like lynchings were in this intimidation and crimes, basically which are unlawful hangings, right? As a means of trying to prevent and intimidate African Americans from voting in elections to influence the laws in the South here, right? Let me change this. I'm going to say of African Americans. All right, we do know that ultimately the African Americans are going to look to the courts to safeguard their rights. That's what the hope is anyway. And we also know that that's not necessarily going to work out, because in Plessy versus Ferguson, which we've already talked about previously when we were talking about Reconstruction, which is one of the Supreme Court cases of the late 1800s. In 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson is going to decide this whole idea of separate but equal. Okay, separate but equal is going to define the civil rights era for the next really 60 plus years. So this is, again, going to upload the Jim Crow laws of the time period. Right? Whoops, I didn't want to bold that. I want to make it red. All right, so we're getting to the finish here, all right? So during the early 20th century, African Americans began what is known as the Great Migration to northern cities in search of jobs to escape a number of different things, right? So they're trying to escape poverty and ultimately discrimination. We know the conditions down there for many of these freed slaves or the descendants of freed slaves was pretty rough. Again, between the intimidation and lynchings and the KKK, it's really not a great place for these people to be. And if they were able to get out, they were trying to get out as much as they can. You also had all the sharecropping agreements that we had talked about after the end of Reconstruction. And such, right? So we know that Ida B. Wells is going to lead the anti-lynching campaign. It's not going to work the way I wanted it to. Right? We also know that effectively you're going to have Booker T. Washington believing that the equality was through vocational education, right? And economic success, except he, there we go, Booker T. Washington. You're going to have W.E.B. Du Bois believing that education was meaningless without equality, right? So without equality, he felt that they weren't going to get anywhere and they're never going to be treated fairly without having equality under the law, right? So he's going to create the NAACP, which stands for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which effectively is, again, it's an organization that's trying to push equality through laws and things like that, right? So that's it for the study guide here. I think there's a couple things that I would probably have included. I realized I didn't completely hit everything, so let's just look at the screen here to talk about a couple last minute things, and then I'll leave you guys to your studying, right? So make sure you familiarize yourself with the strikes a little bit, right? So you have the Haymarket Strike, which is in Chicago. That's going to be pretty important. It could show up in your on the matching parts, right, where you have the anarchists throw bombs and kill a number of police officers. You're going to have workers that are killed by the police, too, to make the things really turn to riots. So you have the Homestead Strike, which is going to occur in Pittsburgh at the Carnegie Steel plants, where the company is going to pay off mercenaries to try to put an end to the strike and regain control of the steelworks. But when they're unsuccessful, the Pennsylvania State Militia is going to have to be called in by the government to put an end to this on behalf of Carnegie Steel. You're also going to have the Pullman Strike, which is going to be led by the American Railway Union under a man named Eugene Debs, who was actually an answer to one of the Jeopardy questions tonight. It was kind of funny. While I was watching that before the live stream. So know about the Pullman Strike, know about the American Railway Union and Eugene Debs, because I can tell you for sure they're going to end up on the matching. So know what a strike is. Laborers kind of trying to they're trying to effectively have leverage over their employer to try to make gains as far as less working time, more pay, things like that, from the conditions where they were working for 12 to 16-hour days for not much. They wanted to get paid what they were worth in their mind, right? You have labor unions, the whole idea of the Knights of Labor, the American Federation of Labor under Samuel Gompers. Again, know these names because they could very easily show up. Might not be a bad idea to write them in on your study guide, because I realized I forgot to put this in there for some reason. I must have skipped over it. So we've also got our Muckrakers I would associate with this as well, right? So you have Jacob Riis. The Muckrakers are investigative journalists on some level who are trying to expose the corruption in society and the problems with society, and trying to help people fix it, right? So you have Jacob Riis, who writes How the Other Half Lives, which is that photographic essay of what the slums and the tenement buildings in New York look like. You have Ida Tarbell, who is going to attack Standard Oil and their unfair monopolistic business practices. And it's going to lead to the antitrust legislature, the anti-monopoly legislation, like the Sherman Antitrust Act. You have Joseph Kepler, who is a political cartoonist, whose political cartoons we've seen. We've seen the immigration one. We saw the Bosses of the Senate one. So he's kind of just pointing out things to people. You have Upton Sinclair, who writes The Jungle, regarding the labor conditions in the meatpacking industry, as well as the quality of meat and things like that that people were experiencing. And people got really upset about this, and this is going to help lead to the Clean Food and Drug Act. So you have Ida B. Wells, as I said before, is going to lead this anti-lynching crusade. So I think that is about it as it covers that. So yeah, so if there's any questions, I'll answer them now. It looks like there's only one of you guys in here besides myself. So at least one of you going to do something good on this test, hopefully. So I'll leave you guys to your studying at this point, and hopefully somebody maybe watch this later. But have a good night, guys, and I will see you tomorrow.